This channel supports the use of ADBLOCK.
It's become sort of a trend for movie-related YouTube channels to do reviews or analyses of movies that were released from yesteryears of lore yonder, far, far away, long ago, before time, history, ages past. And while I may not be a movie channel per se, I figured I'd throw my hat in there as well and take a look at a movie that I absolutely adore, that I genuinely think does not quite get the recognition it deserves. Megamind. Ah yes, that good old classic movie that came out in 2010. If you don't get why this is a joke, I can't help you. And yes, there have already been plenty of videos documenting just exactly why Megamind is a true piece of genius, and they've been viewed millions of times over. But even those aren't really doing quite enough justice to the masterpiece that is this movie. The amount of clever jokes and writing, the pacing of this movie, the references, the consistency in its storytelling and continuity, the character arcs, the way the movie plays with the stereotypes of superhero stuff, the layers and layers of complexity hiding in plain sight, all of it is just downright amazing. And the weirdos that reviewed this thing poorly by calling it tired and cliched just didn't have a clue what they were watching and the majesty of what they were witnessing. When this thing came out, it was compared very unfavorably to the other things that were releasing around that time, like Despicable Me and The Incredibles, and the fact that those comparisons were even made goes to show how misunderstood this movie actually was. But I'm not going to just talk about what's in the movie Megamind that makes it so amazing, but I'm going to highlight an aspect of Megamind that keeps it amazing, that you don't really realize till you take a good long look at it. And that is the fact that Megamind is a stand-alone film. And that's a huge deal, and actually a big part of the reason why it is so amazing. So, let's take a look at
Part 1. SEQUELITIS.
Believe it or not, the concept of a sequel was developed as early as the late 17th century. Yes, people have been trying to capitalize on the commercial success of a product by releasing a follow-up for more than 200 years now. It began with printed media and the growth of print culture back in the late 17th century to early 18th century, and the rise of the market system, which ultimately shifted the text-based reading culture to an author-based reading culture. What this essentially means is that people went from talking about interesting texts from any author to talking about specific authors who had written particular texts. And so followings would develop around authors or works that had already gained a measure of success among the general public. As such, it became easier to market and sell a work that was based on an already successful published work instead of starting from scratch all over again. Thus was born the idea of a sequel. And as more works were made for the public and the public was required to economically sustain the person who was creating those works, sequels became the way forward for the financial stability of the publishing industry as a whole. But sequels weren't always thought of simply as money-grubbing opportunities the way most movie sequels are thought of today. In fact, sequels were a means of safeguarding the intellectual property of the original author. In the early 18th century, copyright laws were about as loose as a pair of... Okay, I'm not gonna go with that joke. You finish it yourself. And as such, one of the ways in which an author could actually lay a strong claim on a particular property was to prove their ownership by producing another work that was just like it. Weird, isn't it? Now that copyright laws are as tight as a... Again, fill in your own joke here, you filthy scumbags. It's really odd to think of sequels being necessary to prove that the works were made by the same person. Especially given the fact that sometimes the sequels of today aren't even made by the same people. They're just owned by the same entity. Or worse, bought over by something with lots of money and nothing else to do with it. Intellectual property and copyright laws are really getting out of hand. But yes, sequels have been around for ages now, and they've always carried this fundamental idea. You make the thing, it good. People like, make another just like it. People like again. It is surprisingly only very recently that a certain disdain descended upon the idea of the sequel being a rehash of the original work. Movie sequels in particular have, starting somewhere in the 80s maybe, garnered a lot of negative press for being unimaginative, derivative, or having simply nothing new to add to the existing work. Sequels that retread similar stories, explore similar conflicts, showcase similar characters and character arcs, these concepts were the fundamental definition of a sequel since the beginning. but these are now the reasons for disliking sequels entirely. In fact, nowadays, the moment a sequel is announced for a particular movie, most people roll their eyes and go, here we go again. They're just going for another cash grab because this property turned out to be slightly popular, often dismissing the sequel before it's even made. And with good reason too, because historically sequels have always been unoriginal works. That was the whole point of them in the first place. And while I may not necessarily be the most informed person to actually detail how this shift in perception of the movie sequel throughout the history of Hollywood happened, I have seen enough of them throughout my 3 decades of existence to see how the fact that Megamind has no sequels is part of what makes it brilliant. Movie sequels evolved to take a few different forms by the 80s and the 90s. The first of which was very much in the vein of do the thing, but more. Films like Home Alone 2, Ace Ventura 2, Die Hard 2, Speed 2, and so on and so on. These movies didn't even try to be very much different from their predecessors, completely riding on the success of the originals alone to have another go at audiences' wallets. The plot lines are almost completely the same. The characters are also reused. Die Hard 2, for instance, is almost the exact same movie as the first one, except that it takes place in an airport now. Speed 2 is even more hilarious, taking the premise of the movie from bus to boat. Genius! And while most of these movies did indeed bomb in some way, some of them were actually still incredibly successful, proving that the formula of do the thing but more was very much a viable one when it came to blockbuster movies. Die Hard 2, for instance, made an extra 100 million just 2 years after the first Die Hard was released. The Lost World, despite its many similarities to the first movie, did gangbusters in the box office, raking in over $600 million in 1997. In theory, here's how the sequel works, and my explanation for these successful numbers, despite the fact that the movies are pretty much the same thing over and over again, but just more of it. Maybe not dialed all the way up to 11, but a healthy 10.5. When a new property is released and does well enough the first time, most people who didn't watch it at its peak would have heard about its success and popularity, and would then take special notice not to miss the second one when it came out. The goodwill earned by the first movie sets up a larger audience to receive the sequel, and most people who did see the first installment would definitely not want to miss out on another go on the roller coaster. So something like Jurassic Park earned so much clout for being awesome that no matter what kind of a movie The Lost World was going to be, people were already sold on the idea. The sequel to that, Jurassic Park 3, however, flopped right back down, proving that either the formula of do the thing but more was starting to die in the 2000s, or people didn't really want do the thing but more in the first place. Maybe people said they wanted do the thing but more, but they didn't really know what exactly that was going to get them. And also, perhaps that goodwill from the first installment really only gets cashed in once. And since the sequel doesn't do anything that will generate new goodwill currency, the prequel, or whatever the hell it's called, often flops. And so, movie sequels needed to reinvent themselves. And they did. And though they may have had noble intentions, no they didn't, the results have had some of the worst repercussions on the industry as a whole. Sequels needed to now be expansions of the existing world of the first installment, not just a retread of all the familiar steps and premises with maybe a change of bad guy or a change of location. The sequel was tasked with taking the established universe and making the next story seem like an almost seamless transition, as if more story existed to be told that couldn't in the first installment. The sequel needed to introduce new characters that were somehow not present in the first installment, but at the same time connected to it in some way, as if lurking in the background the whole time. The sequel needed to take the character arcs of existing characters and extend them in some way, so that character growth and development appeared to be natural across both movies. The sequel had to be both new and familiar, both recognizable and still fresh, appealing to both new fans and existing fans alike. But as you can already see where this is going, you can't really write narratives this way. You can't write a single narrative and make it good while at the same time planning for the narrative to be continued in a sequel. That's just not how stories are told. Imagine if you told bedtime stories this way, your kids would never fall asleep. And so arises a movie condition I like to call sequelitis. Some media outlets have referred to this condition as sequel bait or a sequel hook, which may share the same roots as sequelitis as I would like to define it, but are perhaps milder in severity. Think of it like a minor cold versus full-on bronchitis. Early forms of sequelitis can present themselves as the milder, less destructive illness of having sequel bait scenarios in the narrative, and can often be ignored by the end of it. It has no long-lasting damage and does very little to damage the fundamental core of the narrative itself. If this condition is left unchecked, however, it can lead to full-blown sequelitis, which does in fact cause the narrative to turn into absolute trash and never recover. In some rare cases, sequelitis can even cause the projected sequel to get cancelled due to how horribly it has affected the original narrative. And we all kind of know movies that have been like this. But first, let's take a look at some mild forms of sequelitis. These usually come in the form of small setups at the end of movies that allow the audience to do that thing that Sherlock Holmes does at the end of the second movie and add a question mark to the definitive "the end" phrase. A great example of this is something like what happened in that hilariously terrible, but still really entertaining watch if you're in the mood for stupid, Godzilla movie in 1998. Most of the movie doesn't let on about how much the movie studios really wanted there to be a sequel, except right at the end, where the camera shows one last surviving Godzilla egg and it hatches to reveal Godzilla Jr. You can already hear the board meetings when this ending was added on. Godzilla 2, Son of Godzilla, or some shit like that must have been flashing in the thought bubbles of the producers. It was the 90s, they were capable of stupid crap like that. They were capable of a movie where they killed Godzilla with fighter jet missiles. Oh shit, spoilers! There was really no shame back then. Well, there isn't really that much shame now either, but whatever. The reason this is mild is because the fact that an egg survives really doesn't do anything to ruin the narrative of the movie. The movie does that all by itself anyway, and you can't attribute how bad it is to the fact that they were really trying hard to make a sequel for this thing. That's mild sequelitis. You can find scenes like these all over the place in movies and other forms of narrative. Marvel has made an entire cottage industry of end credit scenes out of things like this. Small scenes that don't necessarily have a large impact on the movie as a whole, but do quite a lot to set up future movies. A slightly more severe form of sequelitis is when you can tell that the movie is purposely leaving things out of its narrative, or purposely creating mysteries or convoluted plot points that do not resolve, or having characters behave in stupid ways because a sequel needs to be made and these characters don't get to do what they should do. Yet. All of it really hangs on the word yet. The narrative makes sense only if you know what hasn't happened yet. The most egregious example of this has to be that Fantastic movie in 2015. Now, this film is bad for a whole host of reasons, but there is also a consistent feeling throughout the film that the narrative really banked on the fact that there was going to be a sequel to this thing. The pacing of the movie, the unfleshed out plot points that the movie just glazes over, the incredible mismatches between character choices and character motivations, it all feels as if the narrative was planning for the places it was going to go, and then only realizing that it hadn't really gone anywhere yet in the first movie. And so they just blitzed through everything and wrapped it all up by the end, causing the tone of the movie to also shift dramatically between its initial body horror approach. Which, fair enough, despite it being a weird take on the Fantastic Four franchise, at least it was an idea they seemed to be willing to stick with at first. And some weird superhero team up learn the power of love or whatever and beat up the bad guy movie. Like I said, there's a lot wrong with this movie. The stupid dialogue, the absolutely atrocious reshoots, the woefully unappealing acting, the woefully unappealing color palette, the woefully unappealing villain, it's just full of woes. But a large portion of the failings and the choices that led up to those failings of this movie stem from the fact that a sequel was greenlit and given a release date before they started filming this thing. They had to account for the fact that the sequel existed before they made the movie. And you seriously cannot write narratives like this. It doesn't work. The Warcraft movie, why does this keep coming up in my videos, is often accused of this problem as well, despite my counter arguments, but I don't necessarily completely disagree. There's so much that was left for the intended sequels. But I attribute that to the fact that Warcraft had no choice but to pluck something out from the ridiculously extended lore that already exists in the universe. We'll come back to this problem again later. This isn't by any means the worst version of SEQUELITIS that you can come across, however. It is perhaps the one that is hardest to distinguish, especially if, like Fanforstic, the movie is bad for a ton of other reasons. And it perhaps doesn't use the sequel hooks and baits really obviously like something of the magnitude of a turd as Green Lantern. No, the worst offender and the most obvious manifestation of SEQUELITIS is the trilogy, as it is most commonly produced these days. First movie success, 2 sequels greenlit and filmed back to back. Especially the goddamn middle movie. Most people disagree with me, and I can understand why. The middle movie tends to be the most exciting and tends to be the most ambitious most of the time. This is in part due to the fact that the second installment has the benefit of not needing to really do anything of any real importance or consequence. Middle movies don't need to establish the universe because that's already been done, and they don't need to resolve anything because they can just do it later. You can just dive in deep into the fun stuff and have as much of a blast with the characters as they like and leave the third film with all the trouble of wrapping up all the bullshit they started. And so naturally, the people who tend to think that middle movies are awesome also tend to think that third installments are the worst. Well, I'm here to say that they're not wrong, but only if you're looking at it as a complete trilogy, which you are free to do, but I'm just saying you really shouldn't. If instead you're looking at movies as individual narratives, middle movies and trilogies are the absolute worst because of that very fact that they don't have to do anything of consequence. Or rather, they can't, because they need to allow the third movie a reason to exist. And so the narrative can be anything it wants to be, which often means it turns out to be nothing at all. It's all tension and climax with no real build-up or resolution. Think Pirates of the Caribbean 2, Matrix Reloaded, heck, even Empire Strikes Back. That's right, I'm gonna criticize everybody's favorite Star Wars. Empire is a movie that says close to nothing, and it sets up Jedi to fail. There, I said it. Come at me, Star Wars fans.
Oh, but you can't just pluck a movie in a trilogy and examine its narrative out of context.
Oh, but you can, because there are examples of middle movies that are actually really good. Every once in a while, you get a movie like Back to the Future 2, which was filmed just like how all modern movie trilogies are filmed. Make one, get success, then film 2 more back to back. The thing about BTTF2 is that whatever happens in the movie doesn't hinge on the fact that there is one more installment coming. There are no real unresolved conflicts, no real unfinished character arcs, no plot threads that lead nowhere. It's actually a singular story that's all wrapped up by the end. They use a sequel hook right at the end to set up the third installment, but it doesn't really have any real effect on 2. BTTF2 starts with a trip to the future to fix a problem in Doc Brown style. I seriously don't get the haters who say this was a stupid idea. Yeah, well, Doc Brown isn't exactly someone I would say has the best compass on making good decisions. The trip has some dire consequences and sets up an alternate reality. They try and fix their mistake with some time travel shenanigans, and they do. Technically, the narrative that gets set up in the start is over. You don't have to watch the third one to be satisfied with the second one. It's fine. The mistake that sends Doc Brown into the past really is the setup for the third movie, but not something that impacts the second. An even better example of this is The Two Towers. Now you can say that The Two Towers is different because it's an adaptation of a book trilogy that is already tried and tested. Okay, fine. So let's examine the narrative of the book as a sequel then. The Lord of the Rings narrative is also one big long story broken into 3 parts, which would make it feel like a typical movie trilogy, and has threads that are set up in the first book that follow all the way through the next 2. And yes, each of these installments ends on a very much unresolved storyline, but each of these individual books also has a pretty complete and satisfying arc for its characters, and major climaxes for its plot points that make each individual book or movie a worthwhile narrative on its own. The Two Towers throws the main focus onto Rohan, and by the end of it, we're not wondering, so what happens to Rohan now? No, the arc of Theoden's story and the Kingdom of Rohan is pretty satisfyingly completed, and we can move on to Gondor in the third installment. Compare this to something like, say, Matrix Reloaded, for example. Nothing in that movie leads anywhere. Nothing in that movie means anything. All of the movie hinges on the fact that the story must be continued in the third one. Seriously, have you ever sat down to watch just The Matrix Reloaded on its own? Sure, it did exactly what the middle movies all do, which is have fun with the established concepts in the first one, but its narrative doesn't actually say anything throughout. You get scenes of Neo having fun being the one, but when you hit the end, you have absolutely zero satisfaction because everything is incomplete. The character arcs are incomplete, the actual plot thread is incomplete, it's all set up with no payoff whatsoever, and it absolutely isn't a movie that can stand on its own merit at all. It doesn't make any sense if you didn't watch the first, and it's absolutely horrible if you didn't watch the third. There's nothing in it that makes you want to watch just it. So you see, middle movies aren't all terrible. There are instances where middle movies can be awesome, but middle movies that try so hard to make sure they're in a place for the third movie to continue, especially middle movies that are filmed back to back with the third one, tend to be horrible individual narratives. That's sequelitis in one of its most serious forms. A movie that suffers because a sequel is supposed to be made. Oh wait, did I forget something? What about all the awesome sequels like Terminator 2 and X-Men 2, X-Men United and Spider-Man 2 and The Dark Knight? Come on, The Dark Knight was amazing! Okay, yes, I'll admit, I too enjoyed The Dark Knight, and yes, it does what I said great middle movies do, and that's have a singular awesome narrative that does not have dependencies on the movies that bookend it. But there's one last manifestation of sequelitis that we must examine, and that is how it affects narratives that are built on pre-existing franchises. This form of sequelitis plagues most comic book franchises, even the good ones. This condition might not be serious, especially if handled by a deft writer and director, but it has a vast potential to screw things up. The problem here is that comic book franchises, as an example, have just a huge library of stories and characters that have been developed and written about over years and years of material. Their stories aren't linear, either, as characters dip in and out of the narrative as a whole, providing new and interesting plots and interactions whenever they show up. Throughout this narrative, there naturally emerges some moments and characters that end up being more iconic than others. An example of this would be the fact that the Batman-Joker dynamic is so iconic that people forget Batman has a whole host of villains that he's had history with. Some of them are actually pretty great, like Hush and Calendar Man, but some of them are so obscure you didn't even know they existed, like Signal Man or the Penny Plunderer. These smaller stories, however, do serve a purpose, not all the time, but most of the time, in the larger narrative. They often act as connecting points between some of the larger stories, downtime for certain aspects of the world to be explored and expanded on. A little detour with a smaller story allows for subtle developments in character that don't necessarily tie into the main plot thread of a bigger one, but does allow for a more rounded narrative when the big story does come around. It's great. The problem occurs when an adaptation of such a franchise needs to use only those large iconic moments or iconic characters. It's the big reason why the Iron Man sequels weren't really that great, if we're being honest. It's also the reason movies like the Garfield Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four Silver Surfer movie, and the obvious piece of trash everyone knows is the X-Men 3 Last Stand are all pretty atrocious. They suffer from the fact that the movies try incredibly hard to string together iconic stories and iconic characters without really making their progression through the overall narratives actually natural and engaging. And so, while a movie like The Dark Knight doesn't necessarily suffer from sequelitis per se, the franchise as a whole still kind of does. Whoever it was that came after the Joker had to be iconic enough to be recognizable, i.e. Bane, yet shoehorned into the existing narrative that was set up in the previous installments. Bane doesn't get to be the Joker, he has to be the follow-up act. And that's just not how those narratives work in the comic universe. Even if the tragedy that befell Heath Ledger didn't happen and he came back for the third installment, that would only cheapen whatever The Dark Knight had achieved with that character. And that's using the example of two movie sequels that weren't absolute trash. When we get to films like The Last Stand, it's incredibly obvious that the movie makers felt that they needed to constantly up the scale of epicness in their sequels, that they thought it a good idea to tackle the Dark Phoenix story, but because they were working it as a movie sequel in an already established movie franchise, the narrative was completely mangled and destroyed, and what came out on the other end was one of the most ridiculous, stupid, garbage X-Men movies the world has ever seen. Until of course they decided to do it again! This is the problem with movie sequels. No narrative can ever be made good if it must bow to the necessity of a sequel. Now we must be clear that there is indeed a difference between a narrative that was intentionally written in parts like The Lord of the Rings and a narrative that is written in order to accommodate another one that hasn't really been fully thought through yet. Or even a narrative that's written and then deliberately chopped up into parts to be sold separately. But before we draw our conclusions, wait, shit, there's another form of sequelitis? You bet your ass there is. We can't move on to our next part until we've covered the very final form of sequelitis, and that's when a sequel is not only bad because of all the reasons that I've stated earlier, but it's also bad because it causes the movies that came before it to be bad. This particular form of sequelitis has really manifested in the recent years of the resurrected movie franchise, with sequels to movies coming out when you didn't think they'd possibly make another one again. The best example I can give of this is Toy Story 4. Toy Story 4 doesn't necessarily suffer from the most obvious forms of sequelitis that I've mentioned earlier, and in all respects, it is actually still a decent movie. The problem with Toy Story 4 is that it cheapens so much of what was achieved in Toy Story 3. All the emotional arcs that came to such a nice close, all the complete character arcs and developments, the conclusion that felt both earned and appropriate for the entire franchise, all of it is ripped away and turned into a farce by the sheer existence of yet another sequel. Toy Story 3 is worse because of the existence of Toy Story 4. And in fact, the entire progression of the characters across the three movies is completely forgotten and rudely trampled over for the sake of the existence of the fourth film. And sure, you can pretend the fourth one doesn't exist, but you can't help but feel like a peaceful grave is being disturbed when you know that Toy Story 4 is out there and people paid money to see it. There are more examples of this, but we must now move on. Holy shit, it's been 28 minutes already? To our second problem. And that is...
Part 2. Prequelitis.
If movie sequels are known for being unwarranted, impassionate cash grabs, then movie prequels are unwarranted, impassionate cash grabs served on a platter of piss and poo with executive fart all over it. It was incredibly surprising for me to learn that the idea of a prequel far predates that of the sequel, at least according to my basic level Wikipedia research. Seriously, if you have more information about this, I'm more than happy to learn. I'm only a Wikipedia schlub. While the word prequel was first used in print in 1958 to describe a follow-up novel by James Blish, the earliest known conception of something that would be considered a prequel would be the ancient Greek classical poem, the Kypria, if that's how you pronounce it, written somewhere around 700 BC, which details events that occur before Homer's Iliad, making it basically a prequel. Now, I'm sure that a conceptual version of the sequel also exists in some form in some of those ancient pieces of literature, but it's also kind of comforting to know that these dumbass practices have been with us for literal millennia. There have been several famous prequels in books and film over the years, but none paints quite as bad a picture of just how horrible and vile the concept of it can be than the Star Wars prequels. You knew I was going to get here the moment I mentioned the word prequel. The love-hate cycle of irony surrounding the prequels is basically one of the internet's greatest memes at this point, and it's almost impossible to have any real criticism of the franchise anymore without wondering if people are triple ironically defending the movie or unironically loving or hating it. Whether you like the movies or not, they are still a great example of what prequelitis can look like. The biggest problem with narratives like the Star Wars prequels is the fact that they have their endpoints predetermined, and the narrative basically becomes a series of conveniences that take us there. And no matter how many twists and turns the story attempts to take, you can tell which actions the characters make are going to matter and which ones are not. You can also tell which characters are going to matter and which ones aren't, because characters that are introduced in prequels are by nature no longer significant and present in the later timeline. Someone like Mace Windu is a completely irrelevant character, having achieved absolutely nothing in the entire saga of films. Okay, side note, I'm not a Star Wars nerd, but I understand that there has been a ton of other material written in the Star Wars universe that flesh out a whole bunch of things, but I'm focusing entirely on the writing of the movies themselves as standalone narratives, so I stand by my comments. The conveniences stretch even further in these movies because there is also the fact that everything is tied back into the universe that the original 3 movies establish, effectively making the universe incredibly tiny. Such a coincidence that everyone who was significant in the original trilogy had significant counterparts one entire generation before this, in several different planets and locations. All the characters are basically in a web of destiny that ties them together throughout the vastness of space, and that's such a garbage way to write a narrative. But that's the inherent problem with regards to prequels. You can't write anything significant because the narrative is held hostage with the end destination that it must reach. If a plot point in the prequel needs to matter, it can only be significant if it's tied into a plot point that exists in the original. If a character in a prequel needs to be significant, they can only do so if they're somehow related to a character in the original too. How convenient! And as if these weren't enough problems already for the very idea of a prequel, prequels also suffer from the desire to explain everything that is present in the later parts of the timeline. Because the end destination is fixed, and because introducing new things is basically the same as introducing insignificant things, prequels tend to fall into the trap of taking basic and simple things that are present in the existing world and unnecessarily expounding upon them when no such explanation was ever needed. Not every character needs a huge and complicated backstory. Not every circumstance needs to be visually explained to the audience. Not every significant historical event alluded to needs to be shown in full. Not every facial scar, every choice of vehicle, every speech impediment, every single unique character trait needs to be given some sort of origin story and played out in front of the audience. Sometimes it's better to just leave things to the imagination. There is, however, an even worse stink of prequelitis than the writing of prequels themselves. Every once in a while, a writer comes along and thinks they can write a prequel to something that never needed a prequel to begin with, and actually was amazing because the mystery and the complexity of the character was more compelling when the audience was left to wonder how exactly they came to be. This writer, filled with hubris, thinks they can improve upon it, giving a story that would match the level, if not outdo the level of complexity that's left to the imagination of the audience. This prequel gets made, and it is revealed that not only was this writer absolutely wrong and the prequel was a typical piece of crap that suffers from prequelitis of the highest degree, but it also actively makes the original movie that inspired the prequel actually worse. It's exactly like that final form of sequelitis in that the mere existence of the prequel serves not only to be a bad film, but to ruin the films that it associates itself with. A heinous crime indeed. There is no better example of this form of prequelitis than Hannibal Rising. Hannibal Lecter is one of cinema's most compelling and most iconic characters of all time. It's particularly fascinating because you only ever get to learn about Hannibal as the character Clarice does throughout the movie. You learn of his idiosyncrasies, his twisted personality, his complex state of mind, and every single time the movie reveals a little more of who exactly the character of Hannibal Lecter is, it also fills you with more questions and intrigue. The question constantly lingers. Who exactly is this guy and how did he come to be the way that he is? One of the best things about this character is the fact that he is written in such a way that those questions don't really need to be answered. Because the real plot here revolves around the pursuit of Buffalo Bill, not the conviction of Hannibal. Hannibal serves as the mirror that leads to Bill, and so the character is left purposely mysterious, allowing the imagination of the audience to fill in the blanks. And then the prequel comes out, and it turns out Hannibal Lecter is just a sob story like every other one we've seen before. The mystery and intrigue and complexity of the character is completely gone, and we are given a peek behind the veil. Sometimes a peek behind the veil can be an awesome thing. Sometimes it can be a Penn and Teller type magic reveal where the knowledge of how the trick is being done only emphasizes how impressive the mechanics of pulling off that trick actually are. But in this particular instance, the peek behind the veil only reveals that there was a steaming pile of trash there and not much else. And here's the worst bit of it all. The Hannibal Rising film was an adaptation of the book, and in this case, that book was written because the movie needed to be made. How stupid is that? Here's a quote from the Wikipedia page. The February 22nd, 2007 issue of Entertainment Weekly features a quote that suggests that the only reason that Thomas Harris wrote the story was out of the fear that a Lecter prequel origin story would inevitably be written without his involvement. Hannibal Rising film producer Dino De Laurentiis said, "I say to Thomas, if you don't do the prequel, I will do it with someone else. I don't want to lose this franchise and the audience wants it." He said, "No, I'm sorry." And I said, "I will do it with somebody else." And then he said, "Let me think about it. I will come up with an idea." That is about the stupidest reason to write a story ever. And that not only makes the prequel a pile of trash, it once again, like its SEQUELITIS counterpart, cheapens the existing character in the original movie. It actively makes the things that it is associated with worse with its existence. And sure, you can always do the same thing and pretend a movie like Hannibal Rising never existed to preserve the sanctity of the original movie and the original character, but just knowing that this prequel was vomited out of the mouth of the person who actually wrote the original thing is enough to taint your memories of the entire franchise forever. And of course, let's not forget that sometimes the character that is given a prequel doesn't even need to be a complex character that is full of mystery. Sometimes a character is intentionally written as a one-dimensional villain that serves the narrative perfectly and needs no further depth or explanation. And yet people, star Disney cough cough star. Oh wait, I wasn't supposed to read that out, I was supposed to do the cough thing. Can't help but make every attempt to milk the shit out of existing franchises and characters and pretend that there was originally depth to something that was never there to begin with. And almost all of the time, this makes the character unfortunately stupid. Some characters don't need origin stories. Actually, most don't if you're doing your job of writing interesting characters correctly. On the whole, prequels tend to suffer from their associated disease more than sequels do. As we explored earlier, certain movie sequels have the ability to be good singular narratives, assuming they were made with proper intentions. Prequels really don't have quite the same chance as sequels do to be decent narratives simply because of how beholden they are to the form. Even when a story is competently written and populated with interesting characters, it can often feel like the journey is meaningless because of where it is forced to end up. The best example of this is the movie Rogue One, which is actually a decent movie which is forced to be inconsequential and contains characters that don't matter because it is a slave to the movie that comes after it that was made before it. And no matter how good the movie is, the fact that it was never planned when making A New Hope means that by default, none of what happens in it has any real impact on the entire universe of Star Wars because all the characters and even the things that happen in the movie itself are never mentioned again. There are, just like SEQUELITIS, a few exceptions to the rule. Godfather 2 is perhaps one of the few instances where a prequel story is pulled off genuinely well, but part of the reason why it succeeded is because it did not rely entirely on the prequel narrative to carry the movie. It instead mirrors the prequel narrative with the sequel narrative, a feat which actually went unappreciated at the time of the film's release, and the mastery of the film really reveals itself upon a second viewing, or upon viewing it together with the first Godfather movie. But these exceptions are few and far between, and now that I've spent so much time telling you all the things Megamind is not, let's finally get to the point.
Part 3.
Presentation!
This is a very roundabout and unnecessarily lengthy way to simply state that Megamind is an awesome movie. But that isn't the real reason why I wanted to revisit this film in a video essay. I adore Megamind for everything it does, how it really manages to be original and creative inside the bubble of the superhero genre. And while it does end up going through certain tropes and predictable paths in its narrative, the journey there is filled with so many delightfully clever moments that the movie outshines everything it has ever been compared to. The narrative is fantastic and the characters are fantastic and the dialogue is some of the most memorable and hilarious that I've ever come across. The design is fantastic, the voices are on point, and the level of whimsy the film embraces is just perfect. But the real reason why I want to gush about this movie is that it stands alone as a singular narrative and remains awesome because it has no prequels or sequels. There is nothing else associated with this movie, and that is a big reason of why it remains awesome. It's like a beautiful masterpiece that is enshrined and captured in resin or varnish and can no longer be tainted by meddling fingers that will seek to do it better. And part of it was by accident, or density, whichever you prefer. You can be pretty certain that when a movie like this is made, the executives are thinking of all the monetizing opportunities a property like this presents. Merchandising, spin-offs, sequels, prequels, anything at all that can be turned into a Disney-level franchise and milked to death for every last cent it can produce. But Megamind, by sheer luck, came out and was perfectly misunderstood by so many who watched it and didn't quite receive the attention that something like Despicable Me did. And look where that movie ended up. Sure, it made a ton of money, but does anyone really have a lasting love for the movie when all you want to do now is burn those minions to the ground when you see them pop up? So many people kept comparing Megamind to Despicable Me, and ironically, Despicable Me ended up being the franchise that got the treatment it did, with sequels and spin-offs and video games and merchandising and every opportunity to overstay its welcome and go from beloved franchise to Despicable Me. Self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess. While all of that was happening, Megamind was very quickly glossed over and forgotten, and more importantly, left alone. And because it was left alone, its narrative remains absolutely awesome. And part of that was definitely by design. Megamind was conceived as a sort of parody of the genre, and as such incorporated elements into it that allowed it to be a singular narrative from start to finish that required no follow-ups and no prerequisite explanations. Everything you need to know about Megamind is there in its narrative. There's nothing left to ambiguity because all of it is explained in the film. Everything from the origins of Megamind and Metro Man, which drives the whole plot of the story, the relationships between Megamind and Minion, the incredibly clever origin story of Titan. Okay, I need to pause here because seriously, if you don't understand just how genius this character is, you probably still don't get why Megamind is such a masterpiece. I could make a whole other video of why the creation of Titan and how Megamind's attempt at making a hero for him to battle as a villain instead turns out to be a villain, making Megamind a hero, is one of the most incredible pieces of writing ever. It's just so brilliant. Anyway, Metro Man's hilarious attempt at retirement, every character having a beautifully written arc, including the general population of Metrocity. Like seriously, this movie gives the citizens an arc that complements the character arc of both Megamind and Roxanne. It's amazing! And all of it is masterfully contained in the movie's 96-minute runtime. And that is a godly feat indeed. The movie doesn't feel bloated, nor does it feel like anything is missing. And as a property that didn't quite do the gangbusters numbers against the properties it continually gets inappropriately compared to, like The Incredibles or Despicable Me, it thankfully never stood a chance to get the shit milked out of it. It did get a couple of video game releases, but those were so low-key and poorly received that it kind of added to the quote-unquote failure of the franchise. And so, with no possible sequels, fingers crossed, we're 11 years removed, but a Blade Runner sequel was made 35 years after the fact, and Mary Poppins got a sequel a whole 54 years after its initial release. And no prequels, because there is simply nothing left in the world to be explained. Megamind gets to be awesome all by itself. And it's such a joy to revisit the movie again and again, because you can tell that it was totally written that way. It was written with no intention to write another, whether prequel or sequel. And because it did so mediocrely at the box office and on the critics' plates, nobody is really pushing for more to be made. And even the people who love it like I do can tell that a big reason why it's awesome and remains awesome is because it's left well alone. And so we too don't want more to be made. It's kind of like how every Back to the Future fan will tell you that nobody should ever remake that movie, no matter how many deepfakes are made of the wishful recasting of those characters. Look, I could wax on about how every single aspect of Megamind is simply perfect, but there are a bunch of other YouTube videos that already do that, so you can watch those for more insight into why exactly Megamind is such a piece of genius. What I wanted to highlight is how some stories are simply better left alone and don't need to exist in a universe or extended franchise. Some stories should be told from A to Z in 96 minutes. And when they are, you get Megamind. You get awesome. And so Megamind is enshrined in a single piece of perfect awesome. It stands alone and it stands taller than every other movie it's compared to because of that. And if you haven't watched it yet, what the f*** are you doing? Why are you watching a video of Megamind instead of watching the damn movie? Don't make me hit you with a forget-me stick. And please nobody start campaigning for anything related to this genius movie to be made. Leave it alone. Please, I beg you. It's weird, isn't it, that we have to tell people how awesome something is and at the same time argue that there shouldn't be more of it? What a world we live in.